has brought me to the journalist, Simone Téry. And so I will be presenting about her chapter on from Ile des Bardes, which I'll explain a little bit more later. But she wrote a chapter highlighting George Moore, and so I'll present that, as well as talk a little bit more about Simone Téry and her connection to Ireland.
Okay, so I'm just going to open with a couple of slides giving a bit of background on George Moore, and then I'll turn it over to the translation that Laura has created from Ile des Bardes, Island of Poets by Simone Téry. So this is a completely new translation. Her book in French has not been translated yet into English, so these are all new translations from Laura. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background. So there's kind of two parts to my presentation. I will stop and Laura will take over. And then at the end of my presentation, I'll talk about the journey up to Slieve Gullion in George Moore's book, Hail and Farewell. So this is Simone Téry. She was the pioneering French journalist in Ireland in the 1920s. She wrote 2 books, came here first at the age of 24, and she's explaining Ireland to a French public, and also became a great friend of A.E. And Laura will get into that in great detail. So the next figure I'm looking at is George Moore. Oh, here we go, okay. So in the mythical pantheon of the Irish literary Renaissance, the highly accomplished prose artist George Moore could be cast as Bricrew Poison-Tongue, Bricrew's Navchanga, in contrast to the druidic sage A.E. This is a portrait of him by Manet, and Manet called this portrait of Moore the drowned man. And Moore was a displaced Catholic, who later became Protestant, but ultimately he was an agnostic. He became a religious skeptic, agnostic, realist, satirist. Great figure, and a little bit neglected like A.E., but a very important figure. But he's the trickster, right? So pretending to a wide-eyed innocence, Moore is the mischief-making trickster, the subversive provocateur, the scandalous gossip, the merchant of mockery and malice. If you have any sense of Irish literary history, so much of it walks out of George Moore. James Joyce is the literary son of George Moore. George Moore is the surrogate father of James Joyce. Moore goes to France and tries to become a French author. Samuel Beckett goes to France and does become a French author. So much of Irish literary history walks out of George Moore. He's that parodying, mocking, subversive voice in Irish literature. Most importantly, Moore as raconteur is a recorder of profound and astute intuitions and insights beneath the mock heroic approach of his great 3-volume combined autobiography and literary history, Hail and Farewell. If you have not yet read Hail and Farewell, you're in for a treat. It is a feast of a book, laugh out loud funny, outrageously gossipy, but very astutely constructed. And it lights up, if ever you've had any difficulty understanding Joyce or Beckett, it lights up all of those dimensions. I'll just mention that in my capacity as a literary historian. Okay. So who was George Moore? Really briefly. So he was born in 1852, so he's about 15 years or so older than A.E. Mason. In Moore Hall, which is now a shell, unfortunately, it was burned by the IRA in the Civil War. An impressive Georgian house sited above Lough Carr in County Mayo. He was born to a landlord family that had converted to Catholicism in the 18th century. This is crucial. So he's often belittled and described as stupid as a child by his dominating father. And this created a deep void of insecurity in George Moore. He talks about that, that is not my interpretation, he talks about that repeatedly in his autobiographical writings, to a sense of this insecurity. So he always wanted to test the reality of whether he had any true friends, including A.E. So he seemed determined to test friendships through shocking indiscretions and provocative and histrionic behavior, and that initially it amused and then infuriated his acquaintances and friends and made him infamous in Dublin. He lived in Dublin from 1901 to 1911. But the crucial thing I want to emphasize is that he was a great writer in multiple genres: novelist, playwright, short story, essays, and especially creative nonfiction. His Confessions of a Young Man, his Memoirs of My Dead Life, and the great masterpiece, the 3-volume Hail and Farewell, which I can only just touch on in this talk today. So brief chronology. So Moore basically has 4 phases: Paris in the 1870s, the great epoch of the Impressionists. He knew them all, and the realist writers. He knew Zola. He was a disciple of Zola. Then London in the 1880s. Then he comes at the end of the 1890s into the orbit of the Irish Literary Revival. Lives in Dublin from 1901 to 1911, and then spends the last decades of his life in London. Dies in 1933. So as his autobiographical writings and the magisterial biography by Adrian Fraser makes clear, George Moore was a deliberate creation. So he created himself of a quest to construct the self, where before there had been only a hazy uncertainty and insecurity. The greatest creation of George Moore, the prose artist and cultured man of letters, was George Moore himself. His writings are a large mirror in which he can finally see a mock heroic version of himself. If ever you read Joyce and you have the Stephen Dedalus character, which is an alter ego construct of the younger Joyce, that's entirely walking out of George Moore's writing. Moore has that same sense of constructing a persona to try and find himself inside the kind of turbulence of the Irish background. 1873, he finally moves to Paris to become a painter after his father's death in 1870, when he was 18. He studied at an atelier, where he became influenced by the praise of such literary artists as Balzac and Flaubert. So when trying to paint, the Julien who was running the atelier would constantly talk about the great Balzac and the great Flaubert. This is the 1870s. Balzac had come to his peak through the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, the great starting period of realism in French literature. Then Flaubert came out in the 1850s with his great Madame Bovary. So basically, what Moore didn't realize initially was that he's getting an education in French literature. So then he resolves to become a writer. Lack of painterly talent and a conviction that writing held more promise, he began to write. So 1877 to 1888, he began his cafe education. This was his grad school to a certain extent. And this is in the famous cafe at the time, the Café Nouvelle Etienne in Montmartre, where he got to know Manet and Degas. So Manet would sit in the corner of this cafe with his followers and disciples around him, and gradually he noticed this isolated figure working, proofreading his manuscripts, and got to know Moore. Moore said he learned the art of conversation in the Café de Nouvelle Etienne, which is New Athens in English. So Manet famously told him, Manet gives him his credo, his artistic maxim. Manet told him, be ashamed of nothing except being ashamed. And this is why we get a almost complete lack of self-censorship in reading Moore. He tells you what is embarrassing, discomforting. He learns this from Manet, a kind of a realist candor and honesty that is discomforting. So he certainly took this to heart. I'm just going to look at a couple more slides, and I'm going to turn over to Laura. This is the Café de Nouvelle Etienne in the heart of Montmartre. Then I'm going to take a break, and then I will come back to the portrait of A.E. and Hail and Farewell after Laura's chapter. So we were just finishing up with George Moore. So he returns to London in the 1880s and produces the first of many novels, A Modern Lover, followed by A Mummer's Wife. A Mummer's Wife has infidelity, it has prostitution, it has mental illness. All of this realism that breaks through the 3-volume sentimental Victorian novel. Said of George Moore that he took on the dragon of English prudishness and slayed it with his candor. So he takes on all of these difficult topics. It's an amazing novel, A Mummer's Wife, and if you want to read anything by Moore, I highly recommend A Mummer's Wife, which A.E. himself praised very highly. So this successfully applied French realism to an English setting and broke the hold of the 3-volume sentimental novels favored by the circulating libraries. So there's kind of a bargain between the libraries and a kind of a censorious sentimentality that you get these big telephone book-sized novels in 3 volumes, but what you would get is sentimentality, melodrama. You wouldn't really get honest portraits. Moore kills that in his own writing. He breaks that kind of spell in British culture. And then he moves to Ireland and applies the same realism to Ireland in novels such as A Drama in Muslim, etc. So he also wrote autobiography, Confessions of a Young Man, in the late 1880s. So this is his account of Paris in the 1870s. Art criticism, he's one of the most brilliant commentators on Impressionism in the 1890s. And then he became very successful with the story of a servant girl who becomes pregnant, Esther Waters. Again, that was very radical ahead of its time, realistic, very compassionate in the 1890s. He then gets swept up into the Irish Labour revival by the enthusiasm of his distant, very Catholic cousin, Edward Martin, and by an acquaintance with W.B. Yeats in the 1890s. He met A.E. in 1899, and then A.E. helped him find a house in Dublin in 1901, and that's 4 Upper Ely Place. If anybody knows A.E.'s background, A.E. had studied theosophy and lived in the Theosophical household at number 3, next door, Upper Ely Place, from approximately 1891 to 1897. So A.E. knew that, literally that street inside and out. Okay, so I'll stop there, and then let's listen to this completely new translation by Simone Téry giving an account of George Moore.
I'll first talk a little bit more about Simone Téry, and I would just like to say I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak today and bring life back to her works and draw attention to her in her own right. Sadly, her work has not been translated, and so a lot of people are unaware of her deep appreciation of Ireland, of Irish culture and language, and of course her deep appreciation of A.E., which I spoke about last year. So her 2 books were well received in France. The first one was En Irlande, de la guerre d'indépendance à la guerre civile, so in Ireland, from the War of Independence to the Civil War. And this is a collection of the articles that she wrote while in France starting in August of 1921. And she loved France so much, she came back and wanted to profile the writers of France. And then she wrote Ile des Bardes, which was published in 1925. And this book sold out in the first month after its publication. What I'll be talking about later, the translation that I will read, is the chapter again on George Moore. And both of these books served as valuable resources in both historical and literary contexts. They're important, but little known today, sadly. In both books, she points to the commonalities between the French and the Irish, and she calls them cousins. And she even pushes the French people to look to Ireland in order to rediscover their Celtic soul. So do you want to show this? So Simone Téry was the daughter of 2 well-known French journalists. And when asked, how she came upon her inevitable journey to become a journalist and writer, she said, "Je suis née dans l'encre d'imprimerie." I was born in printer's ink, and there are her parents there. So her father was a brilliant professor, journalist, and finally editor of L'Oeuvre. That was a left-leaning newspaper in Paris. And her mother, Andrée, was a prominent journalist and novelist. And she is still known today as a feminist, anti-fascist, and anti-colonial journalist who paved the way for women later. She paved the way for women who later would become investigative journalists, like her own daughter. So when Simone Téry was 7, her parents divorced, and her mother did not get custody. But both parents kept a steady watch on her education and career. Her stepfather, Jean Dardenne de Tizac, his pen name was Jean Violis. And this is a name that Andrée, her mother, adopts when she becomes a famous journalist. She takes the pen name of her second husband, so André Violis. But her stepfather would take her to socialist meetings, and so not only did her family influence her career, it also influenced her left-leaning politics. She received a bachelor's degree in philosophy and education and took exams at the Sorbonne to become a teacher, and she taught in Morocco for 2 years before becoming a journalist. So both mother and daughter shared journalistic aptitude, courage, and love of travel. Their careers took them all over the world. Oftentimes they would be reporting in the same country, including Ireland, at the same time, but for different papers. Although they supported each other and spoke of each other positively, they led very separate lives. So in August 1921, the turbulent situation in Ireland as the War of Independence finished occupied French public opinion. So Gustave Téry, again, he was the editor of L'Oeuvre, sent his daughter, aged 24, to report on what was going on. That was her first journalistic assignment. Her articles brought a clear, analytic, yet empathetic vision of the complicated issues. For Téry, though, Ireland was not just a subject for her articles. Suzanne Normand, she was also a prominent journalist. She wrote, she interviewed Simone Téry. This was in a journal called Nouvelle Littéraire, Literary News. And this book is a collection, rencontres, meaning meetings, of the interviews that she does. There's 27 different interviews with female writers, and Simone is one. And so Normand interviews her, and Téry tells Normand, in reality, her assignment in Ireland, was a great revelation of my life. In this atmosphere of youth, enthusiasm, and mystic dreaminess, I found myself in my country, on my land, among my race. I discovered with joy that I was a Celt. She told her father, upon her return, of her self-discovery in Ireland, and she begged to go back. He couldn't see the sense since Ireland was out of the news at that time. The desire to return to Ireland persisted, and so she applied for an obtained grant, which allowed her to return, and spending a year among Irish writers. She brought back her book, L'Île des Bardes, Notes on Contemporary Irish Literature, so the Isle of Bardes. So oftentimes the titles translated as Island of Bards, Islands of Poets, and I was never sure which one exactly to use. And then in the Irish Statesman, she was an Irish statesman, she had referred to her own book, and she said the Isle of Bards. So that's what I'll translate that. But it's sort of a modest title when it says a Notes on Contemporary Literature. Again, it was a well-respected resource and literary discussion around that time. It's a brilliant, astute study of the ancient legends, and it has some detailed portraits of Yeats, A.E., Synge, James Stephens, George Moore, and James Joyce. Normand writes that they, the writers that she profiled, found in this young woman of curious and sensitive mind a warm historian, as well as a lucid, insightful, profound, and sometimes cruel critic. For the first two chapters of Île des Bardes, they show how deeply Téry absorbed the Celtic spirit of Ireland. She speaks of the poets who had started the work that the heroes of the independence continued. She states, the liberty of Ireland was dreamt of by a solitary poet at first, and because so many poets had passionately dreamt it, it became a reality. She wrote that what prevented Ireland the most from discovering a soul was that it had lost its language. She traces the rebirth of Irish language texts and the contributions of Standish O'Grady. She said that Irish was one of the oldest and richest language. At the same time, energetic and musical, where sounds hit like rocks or slide like water. With this wealth of sounds, it explains how Irish speakers have an aptitude for languages. And Téry not only made reservations, but she actually took Irish classes that were taught by Douglas Hyde. And she says that English might remain the language of business, but Irish will conserve the national culture. It will be the language of the heart, the spirit, the poetry and thought, the guardian of the Irish soul. She predicted that Irish would be bilingual. Well, that hasn't happened yet, but I think Raymond and Patrick are working on that. In chapter 2, she delves into the myths of Ireland, tracing themes and highlighting the uniqueness of Irish myths set apart from classical myths by the beautiful, magical places of Ireland. Going back to the interview in Rencontre with Normand and Téry, Normand asked Téry if any of the writers had made a lasting impression from her profiles in Il des Bardes. And she says, certainly, the very dear and very great A.E., who stayed my friend. A.E., a sage like there was in antiquity. She goes on to say in the interview that she loves those like A.E. who have the sense of greatness and also possess sincerity. Quote, to be sincere, to pull off one by one all the masks that disfigure us, that is genius, and that is what is the most difficult. So at last year's festival, I shared parts of her chapter on A.E. from Il des Bardes, and that is also in the Celtic Junction Arts Review. That's a large part of that speech if you're interested in reading that. There we saw her deep affection and respect for A.E. Today, I will share her profile of George Moore, a very close friend of A.E.'s. Téry, as Normand states, was an insightful yet sometimes cruel critic, and we saw no cruelty in the portrait of A.E. How could there be any? As George Moore himself said, the only fault about A.E. is that he has no faults. Yet George Moore will not escape Téry's cruel, insightful, yet fair critique, perhaps giving him a taste of his own harsh medicine. So in this presentation, we will see some stark contrast between A.E. and George Moore, but we can also understand how A.E. would have respected Moore's love of art, talent, and originality. And so the following parts are the excerpts from her writing on George Moore, and she starts by making a sharp contrast to A.E., who lived most of his life in Ireland. She writes, George Moore is a poor man who spent his life running after his motherland. Born in Ireland, first of all French, then Irish, and then English, each time George Moore would announce to the world, rejoicing, that he had finally found the country of his dreams, and then he would burn what he had loved. It's a sad fate, in truth, that of this eternal exile, of this man without a country who is searching for a homeland across the world, he believes finally to have found it, and he cries out with joy, but at the moment of seizing it, it escapes him, like cool water on the lips of the feverish Chantal. Who will say to George Moore that in order to find one's country, it is not necessary to make such big trips? It suffices to stop and look in one's heart. But that would be useless because poor George Moore does not have a heart. As Patrick mentioned, Moore left Ireland for France to pursue painting. In France, I find that his true calling is writing. And as Téry states, this Paris, where he breathes as in his natural element, finally reveals him to himself. His vocation is not to be a painter, but an amateur of art and souls, is to voluptuously play with ideas and images. George Moore left us the most living and penetrating pages on Paris at that time, Montmartre and its extreme bohemia, the Impressionists and their paintings, writers at the end of the century that all Parisians should know. In truth, she goes on to say, that no writer left us a more complete and charming picture of Paris after the Franco-Prussian War, still agonizing about the great ordeal, searching for itself, and working on revival. But George Moore does not study Paris objectively, like a scientist would study an animal. He never forgets himself. He applies himself at being a Parisian among Parisians, and as it often happens for foreigners, he becomes more Parisian than the Parisians. He realized the conventional type of the Parisian, such that exists in popular novels and in the imagination of foreigners. He cultivates an elegant skepticism, a nonchalant cynicism that he finds very fashionable. He speaks with detachment of the easy life of Paris, of his adventures and of its good fortunes, for the secret delight of shocking the prudish English. He adopted not only our habits, clothes, and soul, but even our language, and he writes sonnets, ballads, and very elegant prose in French. Then, after 10 years, at the moment when is going to become incurably French, he abandons his adopted homeland. He says, "I left Paris abruptly, without warning anyone, and that is a revelatory trait of my character. I knew in my heart of hearts I would never come back." So in 1882, our Parisian disembarks in London, and indeed he obtains his little success with his floppy necktie, his large pants, his little hat, his beard, and his French accent. But he will have to acclimate himself once again and relearn his language. During long years, he works at making himself a style, and because he is very tenacious and intelligent, at the end of 20 years and after about 10 books, George Moore has become one of the best English prose writers. Yet this writer, who manipulates the English language so well, is not English. He is no longer French. He is not yet Irish. In a form so perfect, George Moore is missing breath and soul. So in 1899, he receives a visit from Edward Martyn and from Yeats. From Hail and Farewell, he says, "Edward, thick in size like an owl, he is nearly missing a neck, blinking eyes behind his glasses, and Yeats, emaciated like a crow, the two stand out against the flowered wallpaper like a black silhouette of a dream." They have come to ask George Moore for his help in founding a literary theatre in London. He hesitates, but in the course of his walks, a mysterious voice cries repeatedly, "Go to Ireland." And then Edward Martyn sends him a telegram from Ireland that reads as follows: "The scepter of intelligence has passed from London to Dublin." And George Moore throws himself headlong into the literary movement. He has finally found his homeland, and for 10 years, he is the most ardently Irish of the Irishmen. In Hail and Farewell, George Moore does not tell us the history of the literary renaissance in Ireland, but the history of his own adventures, George Moore in the middle of the literary movement. Yet in the same way as he does in his other books, Confessions of a Young Man, Souvenirs and Impressions, and Memoirs of My Dead Life, George Moore, without ever forgetting himself, resurrected post-war Paris. In Hail and Farewell, he resurrects Dublin in the first 10 years of the century. It is said that George Moore had fun taking the most harmless people aside and whispering mysteriously to them, "You know, I'm going to write a book about the people I meet here, and I will tell all." And he would throw a meaningful look at a terrorized, unfortunate victim. And indeed, in his trilogy, he told all and more, because George Moore, who spent his life writing his confessions, confessed above all the sins of others. He enters the most secret life of his friends with a calm impudence, and then this brawler drags his spoils onto the public trestles and shows it to all the onlookers with commentary. In contrast to A.E.'s kindness and ability to bring out the best in others, Téry goes on to say that Moore delicately approaches his victims. He disguises his true nature with velvet paws, imperceptibly, but he scratches while caressing. What refinement in the malice, what spirit in the satire, what verve in the exhaustion. Like the cat who makes a mouse jump in the air, he gets excited in his own game, and having firstly touched his man with a negligent paw, he takes him again and again, turns and tosses him over and over, until the unfortunate victim, due to the scratches, is an inert wreck in his cruel paws. George Moore is a great artist in mean tricks. So Moore's caricatures are lively and, by and large, lifelike. He paints from afar and from the outside, which permits him to sketch the most apparent traits of the body and soul. But what is apparent is not always what is essential. George Moore does not get close enough to his models to see the details, to seize the profound reality. In order to understand beings in the living reality, one has to approach them with a spirit of sympathy, and George Moore scarcely has sympathy except for himself. That is why his portraits, such amusing caricatures, give only a superficial resemblance. They are unfair because they are incomplete and they do not go any further than the surface. So naturally, George Moore's trilogy, Hail and Farewell, was enthusiastically welcomed. First of all, because it's the work of a great artist, but also because it tickles what is secretly diabolical in each person. What a pleasure to see the grandeur lowered, the genius ridiculed, virtue lost, the hero dragged in the mud, the god loved. What a pleasure to see the most noble spirits, no longer in their noblesse, but in their smallness, in their infirmity, and like us. Finally, here we are, avenged. And even the best encouraged with this sacrilege, smiling at the poisonous stings. There is not one of us who has not taken an extreme pleasure in savoring the exquisite treachery of Hail and Farewell, but it is nothing to brag about. There is still a portrait missing in George Moore's grand gallery of portraits. It is of the author. He talks about his own falling shoulders and his feminine hands, but we see him poorly. Fortunately, Miss Susan Mitchell, who is, with Miss Sarah Purser, the most witty woman of Ireland, who repaired the regrettable omission. Here's how, thanks to Susan Mitchell, we conceive George Moore. She says, George Moore appeared to me like a man of average size with a face and a head in the form of an egg. Light blonde hair in perpetual revolt against the brush, a strong nose with wide nostrils, gray-green eyes, remarkable eyes, a mouth prone to impatience, lips thick in the middle like a bee had stung them. He had shoulders the shape of a champagne bottle and a silhouette rather heavy and awkward. But he would move through a room with unusual grace in the salons of Dublin. Later, seeing George Moore in the street, I discovered that he was the only man in Dublin to walk with elegance. He would wear a top hat, and when Moore wore it like a crown on his blonde head, or when he held it graciously under his arm, the hat acted on Dublin like an incantation. I remember I myself paid him homage immediately. And Mitchell continues. Said George Moore's face is dear to the caricaturist, and he himself is sometimes a caricature. The blonde hair, the heavy traits, the cunning smile, the malice, the vanity. But if someone starts to discuss an idea, in an instant the contours change. This shapeless fat man disappears, the jaw elongates, the bones show, the eyes darken, the eyebrows become straight, the look sharpens like that of a falcon. One cannot make a caricature of this Moore. It is the face of a thinker, of a man who manipulates ideas like a master. Téry adds, this elegance, so manifest in his person, we find it in his mind. George Moore is essentially a man of the world. There are men, he writes, who spend their life observing bees and ants, noting the habit of these insects. My pleasure is observing the human mind. But, Téry writes, the human mind, it is not in himself that he observes the human mind that interests him. The human mind that interests him is the one that shows itself in the salons. The impulse to see people's homes is so primeval in me, and that is irresistible. He even writes, conversation is the breath of my nostrils. I observe the movement of life, and my ideas spurt out spontaneously, like buds on a branch. Men and women, oh, the force of lively faces. What magic there is in conversation. And I think the joys here of conversation and gathering is something that both A.E. and George Moore shared. Yet as Téry states, if George Moore loves the world so much, it is not only because he finds a field of observation there, it is especially because he can shine there. Because George Moore is essentially vain, he wants to surprise at any cost. From there undoubtedly come his paradoxes, his audacity, his ostentation of indifference, and his immorality. His elegant cynicism is only another affectation. He claims that Manet taught him not to be ashamed of anything except for being ashamed. Yet it seems that poor George Moore has always kept the shame of being human. Because in truth, George Moore is probably much better than he wants us to believe. The man capable of writing Esther Waters, the story of a poor servant, or The Lake, the story of a village priest, full of torment, and the man capable of feeling for A.E. an affection that he is almost ashamed to admit. This man is not a monster. But be a man like other men, who will notice you. George Moore prefers that one speak of him like a monster than to suffer one not speaking of him at all. And that is why he gives off airs of being a monster. His vanity, it manifests itself, among other things, by boasting, which is perhaps the most unpleasant to men and women. In each of his books, he tells us of his good fortunes, and he reports them in great detail. One day, someone doubted the truth of his stories, and George Moore flew into a fine rage. In that moment, he was going to initiate a lawsuit against his slanderer, calling in evidence all the women he had seduced and all the husbands he had fooled. We are all familiar with the terrible epigram by Miss Sarah Purser on this subject. She said, "Some men kiss and don't tell. Others kiss and tell. George Moore doesn't kiss, but tells." George Moore's prose is one of the prettiest of the English language. Moreover, it has all the qualities of excellent prose, and George Moore did well from his stay in Paris. It is elegant and fine, crystal clear, light and sinuous. It is brilliant and sparkling. It has gentleness and caresses, and then sudden jumps like bursts of laughter. George Moore is not only a man of the mind, he is also a man who knows how to see. This remarkable art critic also knows to appreciate beautiful landscapes. But if he describes, like he would a painting, the countryside of England, of Ireland, of France, what ravishes him above all are the cities. There, in the middle of men, he feels at home. And nobody has felt more deeply the beauty of Paris, London, or Dublin. George Moore, salon psychologist, is also the poet of cities. Finally, to close her chapter, Téry states, "It is a joy to read George Moore's exquisite prose. Yet all the while undergoing the charm, one ends up getting tired of it, wanting to escape. After having breathed in the atmosphere of the salon, one aspires for the pure air of the fields and woods. A gavotte dance of perfumed marquises in the salon is a charming spectacle, but one may prefer the free dance of fairies under the heavens." So Terry's nod here to the Celtic spirit and return to nature lead us nicely to Patrick's portion and AE's influence on George Moore and their trip to Slieve Gullion.
Very good, so thank you. So that was a treat, because that's a completely new translation from Téry from basically 100 years ago of an account of George Moore. So George Moore has a 3-volume autobiography. It's also folded into a history of the Irish literary Renaissance called Hail and Farewell. The star of the second volume basically is A.E. So I'm going to just read you some quotes from that second volume, Salve, in the middle of Hail and Farewell. And George Moore does his best to find weakness and flaws in A.E. And George Moore is an honest broker, in that this guy is a relentlessly candid realist and satirist. And so if we wanted to test the gold quality of this writer, the great George Russell, that we're trying to resurrect and resurface, Moore would have found if there was false gold, and doesn't find false gold. So I'm just going to read you some quotes. I'll do this relatively fast. So you guys can see that. Okay. When we first meet him, he says, "Here is the mind of Corot in verse and prose. Here is the inspired hour of sunset. And it seemed to me that this man must live always in this hour." And that he not only believed in Arcady, but that Arcady was always in him. Those two references. Corot was a great, generous, late 18th, early 19th century French artist, very famous for giving his charity, and he's sort of a forerunner of Impressionism. Arcady is the bucolic kind of pastoral ideal of ancient Greece. So that sense of generosity and some kind of an idealistic state of mind are in those illusions. Moore says of A.E., "While we strive after happiness, he holds it in his hand. I said, and it was to meet this man that I come to Ireland, as much as to see the plays. So Moore had been in Paris in the 1870s at the heart of the Impressionists. He knew the Impressionists. He'd been in the 1880s London as Victorian novel was broken down into a new realist, honest form of fiction. So coming to Ireland in 1901 is that crucial decade, 1901 to 1904. The Abbey Theatre will be formed in 1904 by Yeats. Yeats is going into his prime, which is published The Wind in the Reeds. So we're in that prime, turbulent, hyper-creative point in Irish literary history. And Moore is in Dublin, in the heart of Dublin, right next to Stephen's Green in Upper Ely Place. So what do they have in common? Both are in a mature state of mind. A.E. Russell in 1901, when he knew Moore in Dublin, had studied mysticism, had become A.E. in the 1880s, had met Blavatsky in London when he was 21, had started to publish, had written at least two poetry collections, Homeward Songs, by the way, and The Earth Breath. So both of them were culturally mature, psychologically mature. You could argue Moore was, as Téry's portrait suggests, had a streak of immaturity in him. But what Moore liked about A.E. was the individuality, right? Moore also, as a realist and a satirist, A.E. called him the Voltaire of Ireland. He saw something in A.E. that he wanted in himself. So one is a realist, the other is a mystic. One is tuned, and A.E. is tuned into the universe as a divine ground. That's not Moore. Moore is a skeptic, a realist, a satirist, and agnostic. He basically sheds his religiosity, his religious identity, becomes an early form of that kind of post-religious identity we're much more used to today in our culture. Okay, so I'm just going to read a couple more quotes from the story of the pilgrimage at the heart of the second volume. So first of all, there's the unity of spirit. So there is but one life. So this is the story that Moore tells about A.E. as a child. Yeats had told me how a child, this is the young A.E., George Russell in Armagh, while walking along a country road near Armagh, had suddenly begun to think. And in a few minutes, the child had thought out the whole problem of the injustice of the creed, which tells that God will punish him for doing things which he never promised to do. If anybody knows Joyce's Portrait of the Artist, this is an early form of that kind of refusal to be damned by hell, etc. In a moment of extraordinary joy, A.E. realized that he had a mind capable of thinking out everything that was necessary for him to think out for himself, realizing in a moment that he had been flung into the world without his consent and had never promised not to do one thing or to do another. And his mind embracing the whole universe in one moment, and that huge cosmic consciousness that we see, the Canadian psychologist Buck writes a book later on this called Cosmic Consciousness, a sense of a unity of the whole universe. He understood that there is but one life. The dog at his heels and stars he would soon see, but the dusk was gathering, were not different things but one thing. So that the heart of the esoteric is an articulation of that gnosis, that there is unity of life and spirit in all of us, and that there is a universal brotherhood of man. So beneath differences of identity, there is this unity of spirit. And Moore articulates that and is trying to understand in his portrait. So he trained as an artist, but what he writes are prose portraits. He's a prose artist. He's painting aspects of his subject at different points to kind of round out the portrait. I'm just going to give you a couple more quotes. So, in Hail and Farewell, Moore's mock heroic comic strategy is he says Ireland needs a Messiah. Now, it's mock heroic. And so he says, I will be the Messiah. And there's no more unlikely person to be the Messiah than Moore, because Moore is too skeptical, too satirical, too realist, not a believer in institutional religion anymore, right? But he doesn't articulate A.E. as the Messiah, but more of a kind of a prophet of the gods on the mountain, particularly Slieve Gullion. So they go, he has this sense of the young A.E., again, a story he's heard from the 1890s, years before he met A.E., A.E. on the Esplanade in Bray in the mid-1890s. And A.E. gives an account of this a little bit too in his book from 1918, Mechanical Vision. So Moore says, I could see him, so just think of him like looking at a subject, trying to see different aspects and painting different aspects of the subject. So he says, I can see him standing on a bit of wall, the young A.E., his long, thin, picturesque figure with gray clothes drooping about it, his arms extended in feverish gesture, throwing back his thick hair from his face, telling the crowd of the sacred places of Ireland, of the Druids of long ago and their mysteries, and how much more potent these were than the dead beliefs which they still clung to. I could hear him telling them that the genius of the Gael, awakening in Ireland after a night of troubled dreams, returns instinctively to the belief of its former days and finds again the old inspiration. The Gael seeks again the gods of the mountains, where they live enfolded in a mantle of multitudinous tradition. Once more, out of the heart of mystery, he had heard the call, come away, and after that, no other voice had power to lure. There remained only the long, heroic labors which ended in companionship with the gods. We heard that in the poem, actually, a bit of synchronicity, that come away, the sense that the mountains hold remnants of mythic energy and possibility and renewal for Ireland. So it's kind of a prophetic moment for Russell. So, but one of the things that's so interesting about Moore is very astute. He is a prose artist. And so he has a deep intuition that us in the festival all have to kind of wrestle with too, which is the sense that there's something elusive about A.E., right? There's something hard to grasp. And so Moore says, the reason I have not included any personal description of A.E. is because he exists rather in one's imagination, dreams, sentiments, feelings, than in one's ordinary sight and hearing. And try as I will to catch the fleeting outlines, they escape me. And all I remember are the long, grey, pantheistic eyes, looking at us from the portrait across the room, that have looked so often into my soul, and such a kindly gaze. Those are the eyes, I said, that have seen the old Celtic gods. Right? Now, Moore had left London because he was critical of the Boer War. He wrote articles critical. The British had set up concentration camps in South Africa. They had imprisoned women and children. And Moore had written with great courage, exposing that condition of brutality. And he'd also written criticizing what he called the detestable and brutal materialism of London and Britain at the time. When people started to celebrate the fact that they were an empire, there were imperial days and imperial parades and celebrations. And Moore cut through that. So Moore is a courageous realist, right? And in coming to Ireland, he's looking to renew himself. He's looking to find a reinvention of his artistry, right? And he says he was the one, he says of A.E., he was the one who could restore me to my confidence in life. And when he left me, a certain mental sweetness seemed to have gone out of the air. And thinking of him, I began to wonder if he were aware of his own sweetness. So Moore tries to meditate on how he is similar to A.E. A.E. is the sage. He is that wisdom we all aspire to. He's a condition, Tolstoy had it, Gandhi had it. He's a condition of integrated personality, integrated creativity, connection to a unity of spirit, something we all aspire in some way to touch in our consciousness. So Moore meditates on himself and his own conscience. And he says, I asked myself, and this is Moore talking to himself, it's like a soliloquy in the book. I asked myself what manner of a man I was. I had suddenly come upon the secret lair in which the soul hides itself. So this is Moore's soul being contemplated by Moore, the skeptic. An extraordinarily clear and inflexible moral sense rose up and confronted me. I had never been able to do anything that I thought wrong, and my conscience had inspired my books. And feeling that I had learned to know myself at last, I rose from the seat and looked around, thinking that in A.E., as in myself, thought and action are one. Like I said in Essentials, though to the casual observer regions apart. But everybody in Dublin thinks that he is like A.E. This is a great line. Everybody in Dublin thinks that he's like A.E. It's everybody in the world thinks he is like Hamlet. We walk together to the great apple tree and sit there talking of Manet and the immortality of the soul. But the reader knows how impossible it is for me to believe anyone likes me for my own sake. He says that again and again and again. There's a void of insecurity and lack of confidence in the heart of Moore, right? A.E. recognized me as the spiritual influence that Ireland had been waiting for so long. On the road to Chelsea, I heard him bring me back to Ireland. He's being a little funny there. It's trying to be a little incongruous. So then they go on a pilgrimage. So they go to Doubt, Newgrange, Tara, and then ultimately to Slieve Gullion when he gets to Ireland in about May 1901. Now it's Whitsuntide. Whitsuntide is a time when the Holy Spirit descends. So Moore is deliberately parroting religious pilgrimage style literature. So he's setting up a kind of a mock heroic pilgrimage, right? And the descent of the Holy Spirit is the descent of a kind of Celtic spirit. You also have to be a little wary of More's irreverence. So, but More does have aesthetic visions, right? Of the beauty of the landscape, the beauty of the countryside, the beauty of art, right? And his lyricism is that kind of aesthetic lyricism as opposed to the mystical lyricism of A.E. So he does describe the Irish countryside in a kind of exalted way. And so as they go to these different sites, the archaeological sites of ancient Ireland, he says, it is wonderful to sit on a tumulus and see one's country under a divine light. An ache came into my heart, and a longing for the time when the ancient Irish gathered about the tumulus in which I was lying to celebrate the marriage of earth and sky. On days as beautiful as this, they came to make thanksgiving for the return of the sun. So it seems we're going to get a convert to Celtic mysticism, but that's a comic strategy by More. More's strategy is inflating a balloon of lyricism, of romantic language, right, of esoteric wisdom, but ultimately there's going to be bathos, anticlimax, and he's going to puncture for comic effect that inflation, right? Because ultimately he's a skeptic, he's an agnostic, he's not sure that there is any merit to those larger claims. Okay? But A.E. impresses him. His voice about A.E. is extraordinarily interesting. So he says here, A.E. is extraordinarily forthcoming, and while speaking on a subject that interests him, nothing of himself remains behind. The revelation is continuous, and the belief imminent that he comes of divine stock, and has been sent into the world on an errand. So unlike the ego of More, with A.E. there's an egolessness, kind of an enchantment. So this is the last slide. So they get to Slieve Gullion, they're on bicycles. This is like, if you know Waiting for Godot by Beckett, which was written in the 1940s and produced in Paris, 1952, 53. This is 1901 in Ireland. We get that kind of Beckettian Waiting for Godot disappointment. So they go up Slieve Gullion. Slieve Gullion is to A.E. one of the sacred mountains of Ireland. It's the place where visions of figures like Finn McCool can be found. More is exhausted. It's a very hot day. He's exhausted. But more importantly, it's important for him not to go up to the sacred mountain, right? So he fails to climb up. A.E. goes up. I heard him say, as I fell back exhausted among some brambles, that man was not a momentary seeming, but a pilgrim of eternity. So that's the heart of A.E.'s mysticism. That we are reincarnating as pilgrims of eternity in material form again and again and again, and we're seeking some ultimate unity of spirit, right? That's a core axiom of his mysticism. A.E. climbs up Slieve Gullion, More stays behind. Great as the force of his will undoubtedly is, he could not infuse in me enough energy to proceed. My body remained inert, and he left me, saying that alone he would climb the mountain. Going to see Finn, I murmured, and had I strength, I would sit with him by the holy lake, waiting for the vision, but I may not. Okay. So what happens? So More waits exhausted in the brambles with his bicycle. A.E.'s gone for several hours. A.E. comes back. He asks him what happened, and A.E. says he had been glad to dip his hat into the lake and drink the soft fogged water, and then to lie at length among the heather. So intense was the silence that his thoughts were afraid to move, and he had lain, his eyes roving over boundless space, seeing nothing but the phantom tops of distant mountains, the outer rim of the world, so they did seem to him. So what he experiences is a vision of boundless space. He doesn't give an account of the gods, but I think there's a certain point where he's a little exhausted by More as well. So the Slieve Gullion is the site of the gods. It's the site of boundless space in terms of what A.E. experiences, but it is not something that More can articulate. So More is an honest broker, but limited to fully understand the wisdom of A.E. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
It's just a short break now until 5 o'clock. And just to point out, you've got 2 books for sale down at the back. By Michael McCarlin. Well, the first was by Michael and Brian McKernan. It's about AAE and its foundations in Armagh, Lurgan and Armagh's early days. And then got the more recent book on the Old Enchantment Lingers, and it's a lovely anthology of AAE's best poetry. So just let you know about that. Okay.
Thank you.